Here we're going to go over these three examples where we're asked to identify the restrictions to the domain. The domain are the x values, so it's just asking us what can x not equal. We need to remember with fractions that the denominator, that bottom number, cannot be 0. So if we look at this first one in the orange box, the bottom number, the denominator, can't be 0. So this x cannot be 0. That is the restriction to the domain. X cannot equal 0. Now let's look at the next one. The denominator cannot be 0. In the denominator this time we have x minus 1 times x plus 3. Here we need to recall the zero product property. What would make this 0? Remember, if you're ever multiplying numbers together and the answer is 0, one or both of those must be 0. So in this case, in order for this denominator to be 0, either x minus 1 equals 0 or x plus 3 equals 0. And we don't want that to happen. So we don't want x minus 1 to equal 0. We don't want x plus 3 to equal 0. So you just solve each of these equations and we will see what x cannot equal. X cannot equal 1 and x cannot equal negative 3. Those are the two restrictions to the domain. For the one on the right, we need to first factor this in order to find the restrictions. We need to turn that denominator into a multiplication problem so we can use that zero product property like we did in the green example. So let's factor the numerator and the denominator. Remember, with factoring, we're looking for two numbers that multiply to give us that last term and add to give us the middle term. In this case, it is negative 4, so it would be x minus 4, and positive 2. Now let's do that for the denominator as well. What two numbers multiply to give us negative 24 and add to give us 2? That would be positive 6 and negative 4. Now that we've done this, let's look at that denominator. Remember, we don't want that denominator to be 0. So what would make x plus 6 times x minus 4 0? Well, the zero product property says if we multiply numbers together and the answer is 0, one or both of them has to be 0. So if x plus 6 is 0, then the denominator will be 0. If x minus 4 is 0, then the denominator will be 0. And remember, we don't want the denominator to be 0. So we don't want x plus 6 to be 0. We don't want x minus 4 to be 0. So just like the one in the green, you just solve each of these equations and we see the restrictions to the domain. X can't equal negative 6 and x can't equal 4. If x equals negative 6 or x equals 4, then our denominator would be 0, and that can't happen.